Hi class. This week I set you a challenging task. I asked you to think about who the narrator of Ancillary Justice is and consider the various complex aspects of her identity. As a wrap-up to this week then, I wanted to review some of the material and make sure you were comfortable with these complicated concepts. I thought I'd start by showing you this infographic put out by Orbit Books. It shows the ships of the Imperial Ratch trilogy. So you have the small mercies, the slightly larger swords, and the largest justices. Now, Breck identifies herself as a justice, the Justice of Torin. She sees herself as identical to the ship. How can that be? Well, if you look at the structure of a justice, you'll see it has the battleship with 200 officers and then 4,000 to 20,000 ancillaries. Breck is one of those ancillaries, one of those individuals who serve aboard the ship and yet are also part of the ship. Breck speaks about her own identity on page 2 of the novel. She says, "I was a piece of equipment, a part of the ship." We might at first think that she means this metaphorically. She's a soldier, a cog in the machine, something to be disposed of in warfare. However, as we read on, we discover that she means it more literally. She is literally part of the ship, in the same way as an engine or a drive shaft might be. So, what exactly are ancillaries? Well, ancillaries are dead bodies who are connected to the ships and to each other via an AI system. This AI system works due to implants in their brain, which hook them to the ship and to each other. For the Ratch, ancillaries act as soldiers and servants. They fight in their wars, they maintain the ship, they look after the officers, they basically do all of the dirty work that needs to be done. Now, if we go back to this infographic, you'll notice that the Justice, at least, has between 4,000 to 20,000 ancillaries aboard a ship. That's a lot of ancillaries to coordinate. So it seems as if the AI coordinates their thoughts and their actions. Effectively then, they seem to have a kind of hive mind. If you're familiar with Star Trek, you might think of the Borg and how the Borg are connected to each other. Just as an aside, I wanted to point out something about the ship's AI that's fairly unusual. Within the world of ancillary justice, AIs have both reason and emotion, entirely for practical purposes. As Breck reflects, without feelings, insignificant decisions become excruciating attempts to compare endless arrays of inconsequential things. It's just easier to handle those with emotions. So when we see Breck use reason, it could be a result of her own mind or of the AI. Likewise, and this is strange to consider, when we see her exhibit emotion, it could be as a result of her mind or the AI. So let's think more carefully and closely about the narrator's identity. The narrator has 3 names in the course of the novel, which correspond to different aspects of her identity. She's known as the Justice of Torin, the ship that was part of the Radchai fleet. She's known as 1ESC-19, one of the ancillaries that was part of the Justice of Torin, and she's also known as Breck, the alibi that she adopts when she goes after Ananda Mianai. Now, initially, Breck seems to assume that these identities are stable and continuous, that she transitions smoothly from one to another. In other words, Breck is 1ESC-19, is the Justice of Torin. However, one of the things I asked you to consider this week is whether that was actually the case, or whether it's more complex, whether there are breaks or splits between these three aspects of the narrator. As a means of exploring this issue, I wanted to look at several passages which give us some insight into who the ancillaries are. So the first passage involves the creation of a new ancillary, as a body is pulled out of storage and hooked up to a ship. It's a horrifying scene, a scene of body horror. This is what happens within it. Don't, I, one-esque, thought at the body. But it wasn't listening. It was sick, it was terrified, it was dying. It pushed itself up and crawled, dizzy, where it didn't care so long as it got away. Then hands under my arms, elsewhere one-esque was motionless, urging me up, and Lieutenant Orne, "Help," I croaked, not in Rajkai. Damn medic pulled out a body, without a decent voice. Help me. So I want you to pay attention to the pronouns here. I thought at the body. It was sick, it was terrified, it was dying. I also want you to note how the body cries for help. At the moment of creation, then, we see a clear separation between one-esque, I in the passage, and the new unit, it, the body. Although this is the moment when they're supposedly being hooked up and becoming one, they still seem to remain distinct, disconnected from each other. Even more interestingly, the new unit seems to retain some identity of its own. We see that it croaks for help in another language. And it's worth asking, who is croaking for help there? I think the only logical conclusion is that it's the original inhabitant of the body. I also want to point out that there's the strong implication that this unit becomes one-esque 19 or Brick. Later in Ancillary Justice, and particularly in the following books, we discover that Brick has a really terrible singing voice, and that's pointed out as the major feature of this unit. So we have this division between the ancillary and the AI, between the different ancillaries at the moment of creation. This split seems to continue, as we see in passages 2 and 3. Brick reflects, "Nearly 20 years later, I would be a single body, a single brain. That division, I, as the Justice of Torin, and I, as one-esque, was not, I've come to think, a sudden split, not an instant before which I was one, and after which I was we. It was something that had always been possible, always potential, guarded against. But how did it go from potential to real, incontrovertible, irrevocable? On one level, the answer is simple. It happened when all of Justice of Torin but me was destroyed. But when I look closer, I seem to see cracks everywhere. Did the singing contribute, the thing that made one-esque different from all other units on the ship? Indeed, in the fleets. So, as I think that passage foregrounds, there's this constant potential for a split between the AI and the ancillaries, and also between the different ancillaries as a group. The split is prevented, it's preempted, it's guarded against, but it's still something that might potentially occur. And an excellent example of it might be found in one-esque's singing. We're told elsewhere in the novel that one-esque starts collecting music and singing as a way to please a former captain of the ship. However, by the point the novel begins, the captain's long dead. One-esque has no reason to continue singing, yet it does. So what are we meant to make of that? Does one-esque, or maybe even a former unit within one-esque, have an interest in music? Is this an expression of individuality? Passage 4 confirms our suspicions. In this passage, Ananda Mianai is talking to Brick and says to her, "You know that each of your ancillary segments is entirely capable of having its own identity." So what this passage stresses is that ancillaries are indeed capable of having individual identities. They aren't a hive mind in any simple sense. So is the implication then that the AI imposes order and cohesion on them? Without the AI, would they act as individuals, just as a Borg might when divorced from the collective? However, passage 5 seems to complicate this scheme that we're setting up. Within it, Brick and the other ancillaries are cut off from the AI in the Justice of Turin. This is a moment of chaos where they're shattered, where they're scattered, where they no longer have a single mind. But look at how they behave. Each of me had to restrain itself from turning entirely to watch Lieutenant Orne, to be sure she was really there, because I couldn't sense her otherwise. Then they eventually sort out who's going to look after her, and one of the segments come around and tell her a murder has occurred. Lieutenant's response is, "Murder? Oh fuck!" And all of the segments near Lieutenant Orne said in unison, "Language, Lieutenant." What makes this passage so interesting is that we have the ancillaries cut off from the AI, presumably working as individuals. Yet we see how synchronized they are. We see the extent to which they work as a unit, even after they're separated. They have exactly the same thoughts and reactions. They turn to look at Lieutenant Orne. They scold her for swearing. Why exactly is this taking place? Is it simply due to their long history of working together, of being in the same mind, of being controlled by the same AI? Does that create a kind of conditioning that remains even after they're disconnected? Or is it a case that the AI's programming itself remains somewhere within their implants, even when they're separated? It's difficult to be certain. And the issue becomes even more complicated when we consider another potential identity that might be in the mix. In this particular passage, Brick is talking to the doctor Strigan, and Strigan says to her, "You're a corpse soldier. I'm certain of it. Do you remember anything?" "Many things," I said, still bland. "No, I mean from before." It took me nearly 5 seconds to understand what she meant. That person is dead. Your sense of who you are has a neurological basis. One small change and you don't believe you exist anymore, but you're still there. I think you're still there. So there's another potential identity we need to take into account. The previous self that remains somewhere in the brain. Maybe the previous self that calls for help at the moment when Brick is hooked up into the system. Brick doesn't agree with this. Brick thinks that former self no longer exists. But we might not want to dismiss it so easily. We might see some traces of her former self, informing her, helping her to make her decisions. At this point, it's worth considering why Brick makes the decisions about Saivarden and Ananda Mianai that she does. Is she following her programming? For instance, when she saves Saivarden, is she acting out of the imperative to serve a lieutenant of her ship? Or is she acting out of a human impulse, not to leave another human to die in the snow? Likewise, with Ananda Mianai, is she seeking revenge for the death of Lieutenant Orne, or is she following the other Ananda Mianai's instructions to kill her rival. It's impossible to tell, and that's part of what makes this novel so complex. So, to sum up the key points you need to know, as a group, Ancillary seem to have the capacity to be both united and divided. They're capable of working as individuals, but that's guarded against, discouraged, overridden by the AI. Their mental processes are equally complex and may be affected by a range of factors. For one, they might be relying on their own individual decision-making, conditioned by their experiences. For another, they might be relying on the AI programming. And we may not want to disregard their past self completely. So the novel is asking us to think really hard about what constitutes identity, about what makes us people, about what guides our decision-making, about what makes us individuals or members of a group. That's all I wanted to discuss in the wrap-up. I hope that this lecture has helped you to get more of a handle on the novel, the narrator, the concepts being explored. Please feel free to ask me questions about it on the discussion board. I'm always very willing to go into more depth about the books. Thank you so much.